I never thought I'd be the person to ignore a cry for help until I became exactly that person. February 1982. Memphis, Tennessee. A massive United Methodist Church building where something impossible was happening right under our noses for 119 days. And if you think you know where this story is going, trust me, you don't. Late February morning, cold enough that you could see your breath inside the older parts of the building. Sam Drash, 42 years old, headmaster of the elementary school housed inside this church complex, stood in his office staring at an empty bowl. Now, that might not sound like the beginning of something that would change everything, but that's exactly what it was. See, Sam spent most of his days buried in administrative work, typing reports, managing staff, the kind of desk job that makes you reach for snacks without even thinking about it. And Sam's snack of choice? Mixed nuts. He kept this big ceramic bowl filled to the brim, always on the corner of his desk, always within arm's reach. But this morning, walking into his office with his coffee still steaming, keys jingling in his hand, he stopped dead. The bowl was bone dry. Not a single cashew, not one almond. Completely empty. And here's the thing that got under his skin. He had filled that bowl the night before. Topped it off before he locked up and headed home to his family. He stood there, arms crossed, that particular brand of frustration you get when something small throws off your entire morning routine. Someone had been in his office. Someone had helped themselves to his entire stash. The church building itself was massive, understand. This wasn't just a chapel with a few Sunday school rooms tacked on. We're talking about a full elementary school, dozens of offices spread across multiple floors, a gymnasium with basketball hoops that squeaked when you walked across the polished floor, a commercial kitchen that could feed 200 people, laundry facilities, storage rooms, hallways that seemed to go on forever. The kind of place where you could work there for years and still discover rooms you'd never noticed before. Memphis in 1982 had this particular quality to it, especially in these older buildings, a kind of settled dust feeling, history in the walls, the scent of old wood and floor polish and something else, something you couldn't quite name. Sam left his office, headed down the hallway toward the kitchen. His footsteps echoed in that distinctive way they do in large, mostly empty buildings. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, that electrical buzz that becomes white noise after a while. He passed classrooms where chairs sat neatly pushed under desks, bulletin boards covered in children's artwork, construction paper cutouts of winter scenes, even though spring was trying to push its way into Tennessee. When he walked into the kitchen, he found the cook at the counter, chopping vegetables with the methodical rhythm of someone who'd done this exact task 10,000 times before. The cook was a steady presence in the church, one of those people who arrived before anyone else and left after everyone had gone, keeping the massive operation fed. Sam said his hellos, walked straight to the pantry, pulled open the door expecting to grab the big container of mixed nuts and refill his bowl. The shelf was empty. Not just the nuts, either. As Sam's eyes scanned the other shelves, he realized multiple items were missing. Crackers, pretzels, those little individual chip bags, all gone. It looked like someone had conducted a raid, just swept through and taken whatever they wanted. And that's when Sam turned to the cook and asked if there'd been some kind of event the night before, something that would explain why the pantry looked like it had been hit by locusts. The cook stopped chopping, put the knife down with a soft clack against the cutting board, turned to look at Sam with an expression that was equal parts relief and frustration, and said something that changed the entire trajectory of the conversation. "I'm glad somebody else has noticed this, because for the last month, food has been going missing for no reason. I don't understand what's happening here. A month. Not a day or two. A full month of food disappearing. If this has happened to you, if you've ever had that creeping feeling that something's not right but everyone around you acts like you're imagining things, drop happened in the comments because that's exactly where the cook had been. At first, he explained, it was minor. Snacks here and there, the kind of thing you could chalk up to kids being kids. Maybe someone forgot to sign out supplies properly. But lately, it had escalated. Items from the refrigerator were vanishing. And here's where it got truly strange. The cook had put a padlock on the fridge, specifically to keep people out, especially the elementary school kids who might sneak in looking for juice boxes or leftover desserts. He'd lock it every single night before leaving. But the previous evening, he'd placed a whole ham in that refrigerator, a substantial piece of meat, wrapped and ready for an upcoming church dinner. He locked the fridge, went home, came back this morning, unlocked it, and the ham was gone. Just gone. Like it had never existed. He walked Sam over to the industrial refrigerator, opened it up, and pointed to the empty shelf where something the size of a small child should have been sitting. The white wire shelf gleamed under the interior light, completely bare. The cook had already reported this to church administrators. They'd said they'd look into it, but their response had been tepid at best. They were baffled, sure, but not particularly alarmed. It was confusing, yes, but what could they really do about it? Sam felt that irritation compound into something heavier. 1, he'd have to do his administrative work without his snacks, which was petty but real. 2, and more importantly, it was becoming clear that students from his elementary school had likely started sneaking into the kitchen, and not just taking snacks anymore. They'd apparently figured out how to get the padlock key, and now they were escalating to stealing entire hams. The audacity of it was almost impressive, but mostly it was just bad behavior that would need addressing. Sam told the cook he'd speak with administrators again, get the lock replaced, get this situation under control. But that feeling, that small voice in the back of his head that said something's not quite right here, he pushed it down, because it was easier to believe in mischievous kids than to consider alternatives. A few days later, March 3rd, Sam walked into the church building for another day of work. The past couple of nights had been quiet. The lock on the fridge had been replaced with a new one, a different key, different people with access, and it seemed like whatever had been happening had stopped. Sam had refilled his nut bowl, and it had remained untouched. Maybe the lock change had done it. Maybe some administrator had quietly had a word with the right people. Maybe the prankster, whoever they were, had gotten bored and moved on. Things felt normal again, or at least like they were returning to normal. Sam walked down the hallway, that same route he took every morning, past the classrooms and offices. As he passed the kitchen, the cook called out to him. There was an edge in his voice that made Sam stop, turn, walk back. The cook was standing by the refrigerator, door open, and there was this look on his face. Not quite panic, but close. A kind of bewildered frustration. Sam approached, and the cook pointed to an empty spot on one of the shelves. "Several bottles of soda were right there last night," he said. "They're gone." Sam felt his stomach drop a little. So it wasn't over. The lock change hadn't stopped anything. But the cook continued, and this is where things shifted. "This is after we changed the locks. There's only a handful of people with access to these new keys. Church administrators, people who would never take soda. So how is this even happening?" It was a fair question. It removed the easy explanation. If only a select few people had keys, and those people were trustworthy, established members of the church leadership, then how was food still disappearing? It stopped being about mischievous kids and became something else, something without an obvious answer. But before Sam could process that fully, the cook said there was more. Ever since the locks had been changed, someone had started messing with his personal belongings. Every day when he finished in the kitchen, he'd leave his work shoes and his apron in the same spot. Consistent, predictable, part of his routine. He'd come back the next morning, put them on, get to work. But now, after the lock change, his items were being moved. One morning his shoes were on the counter, which made no sense at all. His apron was draped over a chair across the room. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was damaged. Just moved. Deliberately rearranged. The cook looked at Sam with genuine confusion bordering on anger. Why would someone do this? They don't even see my reaction. What's the point of messing with someone's stuff if you're not there to watch them get upset? It doesn't make sense. And Sam had to agree. It didn't make sense. Pranks usually had an audience, a payoff for the person doing them. This felt targeted but pointless, malicious but aimless. He told the cook he'd report it again, see if they could change the locks yet again, maybe implement some new security measures. He didn't have answers, but he'd try to find some. Sam left the kitchen and headed toward his office, mentally composing the report he'd need to write up for the administrators. This had gone on long enough. Someone needed to take this seriously, figure out what was actually happening. His mind was running through possibilities, most of them unsatisfying, when he walked into his office and stopped. There was something on his desk, right in the center, impossible to miss. A paper towel, not folded neatly, not placed there deliberately as part of some cleaning routine. Just a paper towel with something written on it in chaotic, rushed handwriting. The kind of handwriting that comes from someone writing quickly, urgently, maybe without much light or while their hand was shaking. Sam approached his desk slowly, sat down in his chair, picked up the paper towel carefully, like it might be evidence of something, which in retrospect it absolutely was. He began to read, and what he read made his blood run cold. The note referenced Leslie Gatis. That name, everyone in Memphis knew that name. 15-year-old girl, abducted from her bedroom in the middle of the night sometime back in late 1981. The case was all over the news. Local stations couldn't stop talking about it. The community was terrified. Parents were locking windows, checking on their children multiple times per night. It was the kind of crime that makes a city hold its breath, waiting for answers that never seemed to come. Everyone assumed she'd been murdered, that her body would eventually be found somewhere tragic and terrible. It was an unspoken understanding, the kind of dark acceptance that happens when days turn into weeks and weeks turn into months with no good news. And this note, this insane, impossible note scrawled on a paper towel, claimed there was something in the church's attic that would change everybody's understanding of that case. Sam sat there, note in hand, trying to make sense of it. Was this a prank? The worst kind of prank imaginable? Using a murdered child's name for some sick joke? Were the kids responsible for the food theft also behind this? It seemed too dark, too specific, too cruel. But kids could be cruel, especially when they didn't fully grasp the weight of what they were doing. The Leslie Gatis case was all over the news. Everyone knew about it, including the students in his school. Maybe this was some misguided attempt at attention-seeking, some way of inserting themselves into a story that had captured the entire city's imagination. But then again, what if it wasn't? What if there really was something in the attic? What if this note, as insane as it seemed, contained actual information about an ongoing criminal case? Sam felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. If there was even a chance this was real, he had to report it. He couldn't ignore it and then find out later that he'd dismissed something crucial. So he called the police. Felt a little foolish doing it, explaining that he'd received an anonymous note about a murder case, but he made the call anyway. And to their credit, the police took it seriously enough to show up. Later that same day, officers arrived at the church. They read the note. They went into the attic with flashlights, moving aside boxes and old furniture, checking corners and crawl spaces. They searched extensively, methodically, the way trained professionals do when they're taking something seriously, even if they don't expect to find anything. They found nothing. Nothing connected to Leslie Gatis. Nothing suspicious at all, really. Just the accumulated storage of a church that had been operating for decades. Old choir robes, Christmas decorations, boxes of hymnals, the dusty detritus of community life. They expanded their search to the entire building, checking offices, storage rooms, anywhere someone might hide something. Still nothing. The officers told Sam his first instinct was probably correct. Most likely a prank, probably connected to whoever was messing around with the kitchen food and the cook's belongings. Tasteless, sure, but ultimately harmless. If anything serious developed, he should call again. But this didn't seem like a big deal. They left, and Sam sat in his office feeling a mix of relief and continued unease. Because even though they'd found nothing, even though the logical explanation was that this was just someone being awful for attention, something still felt wrong. The pieces didn't quite fit. Mischievous kids stealing snacks, sure. But writing notes about a murdered child? Moving personal belongings in patterns that served no purpose? It felt like there were multiple things happening at once, or one thing happening that he couldn't quite see the shape of yet. Over the next couple of weeks, the situation didn't improve. It escalated. Food continued to disappear from the kitchen despite multiple lock changes. The cook's items kept being moved. And the notes, those disturbing handwritten messages on scraps of paper and paper towels, they multiplied. They started appearing on other church officials' desks, in storage closets, tucked into bookshelves. Most of the other church officials were firmly in the "this is definitely a prank" camp. They were annoyed, sure, frustrated that someone was wasting time and creating this bizarre atmosphere of unease, but they weren't seriously concerned. It was juvenile, it was tasteless, but it wasn't dangerous. Sam wanted to agree with them. He tried to agree with them. But something kept nagging at him. The notes weren't funny. Pranks were supposed to have some element of humor, some reveal where everyone could eventually laugh about it. These notes were just unsettling. And the person writing them never got to see anyone's reaction, never got the satisfaction that pranks typically provide. It didn't add up to the profile of a typical prankster. The breaking point came on a Sunday. Sam was at church with his family, as he was every Sunday, sitting in one of the middle pews. His young son was in the front, fidgeting the way kids do during services. At some point, his son reached forward and grabbed one of the Bibles from the pew in front of him, the way kids do when they're bored and need something to occupy their hands. He opened it, and a note fell out. One of those handwritten messages on a paper towel, fluttering down to the pew cushion. Sam watched his son pick it up, start to read it, and Sam's heart stopped. His child, his young boy who should be safe in church of all places, was reading a note about Leslie Gatis, about murder, about things no child should have to process. Sam took the note from his son's hands, tried to explain it away as someone being inappropriate, but the damage was done. His son looked confused and a little scared, and Sam felt fury rise in his chest. This had crossed a line. Leaving notes for adults to find was one thing. They could process it, dismiss it, handle the emotional labor of dealing with disturbing content. But putting notes where children would find them? That was unacceptable. Absolutely unacceptable. Sam decided right then that this had gone on long enough. Something had to be done, and if the other administrators weren't taking it seriously enough, he'd take matters into his own hands. On March 17th, about a month and a half after all of this had started, Sam approached the church's maintenance crew with a proposal. He wanted to set up a stakeout. Stay in the building overnight, hide in strategic locations, and catch whoever was doing this in the act. Because by this point, Sam's thinking had evolved. He no longer believed this was just kids from the elementary school. This felt too organized, too persistent, too dark. This felt like an adult. Maybe someone from outside the church entirely. Someone breaking in for reasons Sam couldn't fathom. It was a disturbing thought, but it made more sense than the alternatives. The maintenance crew agreed, some more enthusiastically than others. They picked March 17th, a weeknight when the building would be completely empty after a certain hour. By 10 p.m., everyone else had gone home. It was just Sam and 3 members of the maintenance crew, positioned in different locations throughout the church. They'd chosen spots that gave them sight lines to the main hallway, to the kitchen entrance, to Sam's office. Places where they could see without being easily seen themselves. The church at night had a completely different quality than during the day. The silence was profound, the kind of silence that makes you aware of every small sound. The building settled, would expanding and contracting with temperature changes, creating small creaks and pops. The heating system kicked on and off with mechanical sighs. Outside, the occasional car passed by on the Memphis streets, headlights briefly illuminating windows before fading back to darkness. It was March in Tennessee, still cold enough at night that the building held a chill despite the heating, that particular quality of old building cold that seems to seep up from the floors and down from the high ceilings. Sam sat in his hiding spot, adrenaline keeping him alert at first. This was it. Tonight they'd get answers. Tonight they'd see who'd been doing this. But as the minutes stretched into hours, as 10 p.m. became 11 became midnight, nothing happened. The church remained utterly still. Sam's initial excitement gave way to restlessness, then to doubt. Maybe this was a waste of time. Maybe whoever was doing this had somehow known about the stakeout and decided to skip tonight. Maybe Sam was overreacting to something that really was just a persistent prankster who'd gotten bored and moved on. The maintenance crew was definitely getting bored. Sam could sense it even though they were all in different locations. This had seemed like a reasonable idea earlier, but now, sitting in the dark for hours with nothing happening, it felt increasingly silly. One of the maintenance workers, a guy named Frank who'd been with the church for years, decided he needed to stretch his legs. He stood up from his position, figured he'd do a lap around the building just to do something, anything, to break the monotony. Frank walked down the hallway, his footsteps quiet but audible in the silence. He looked into rooms as he passed, seeing nothing but familiar spaces rendered slightly strange by darkness and limited lighting. He was heading toward the nursery at the far end of the building, not expecting to find anything, just killing time. Then he heard something. Movement. Behind him, back the direction he'd come from. He turned around, expecting to see Sam or one of the other maintenance workers, maybe someone else who'd gotten restless. But what he saw instead made his breath catch. A light had come on in the kitchen. Not the overhead fluorescence, but a smaller light, like someone had opened the refrigerator. Frank's mind raced. This was it. This was what they'd been waiting for. Someone was in the kitchen right now. He moved quickly, trying to be quiet but also trying to cover ground fast. His heart hammered in his chest. He reached the kitchen entrance, pushed through the door, and what he saw made absolutely no sense at all. Standing in the kitchen, illuminated by the open refrigerator light, was a teenage girl, thin, pale, wearing clothes that looked like they hadn't been changed in weeks. And behind her, partially obscured by shadow, was a man, older, maybe in his 40s, watching her with an intensity that made Frank's skin crawl. The girl saw Frank. Their eyes met, and in that split second, Frank saw everything. The fear, the desperation, the relief, the terror that this moment might slip away. She ran. Just bolted toward Frank like her life depended on it, because it absolutely did. She literally threw herself into his arms, holding on to him like a drowning person holds onto a life preserver, and Frank, to his eternal credit, didn't hesitate. He grabbed her, held her tight, positioned himself between her and the man who was now moving. The man, later identified as Ernest Stubblefield, 42 years old, made a split-second calculation and ran. Took off in the opposite direction, deeper into the church, and within moments Sam and the other maintenance workers were there, chaos erupting, someone calling the police, and Leslie Gatis, 15-year-old Leslie Gatis, who everyone thought was dead, who'd been missing for 119 days, collapsed in Frank's arms sobbing. The truth was impossible. The truth was worse than anyone had imagined, but also better, because she was alive. Ernest Stubblefield had taken her from her bedroom that night back in late 1981. But he hadn't killed her. He'd brought her to this church, to this massive building with its dozens of rooms and hidden spaces, and he'd found a crawl space in the attic that nobody knew existed. A space that was just large enough for two people if they stayed quiet and still. And he'd kept her there for 119 days. Ernest had held her at knife point, watched her constantly, told her repeatedly that he was going to get ransom money, that as soon as the ransom came through she'd be let go. But Leslie was 15, not stupid. She could see there was no plan. No ransom demands were being made. Ernest was improvising, living moment to moment, and eventually he'd have to do something permanent to ensure she never talked. She understood with growing clarity that if she didn't save herself, she was going to die in that attic. So in the rare moments when Ernest's attention wavered, when they snuck down to the kitchen late at night after listening carefully to ensure everyone was gone, Leslie acted. She didn't just take food for the two of them. She took massive amounts. Way more than two people would need. Entire containers of snacks, whole hams, bottles of soda. She was trying to create a signal, a pattern obvious enough that someone would realize something was wrong. She moved the cook's belongings, his shoes and apron, arranging them in ways that made no sense, hoping someone would understand that this wasn't normal behavior. And in the rare, precious moments when Ernest fell asleep or was distracted, she'd grab whatever she could write on, a paper towel, a scrap of paper, and she'd write frantic messages. "My name is Leslie. I'm in the attic." She'd leave them anywhere she could, on desks, in Bibles, in closets, desperate prayers thrown into the void hoping someone would believe. But almost everyone thought it was a prank. And the one person who didn't, Sam, who took it seriously enough to call the police, well, when they searched the attic, they were feet away from her. Feet away. She was right there in that hidden crawl space, holding her breath, terrified Ernest would kill her if she made a sound, and the police walked away convinced there was nothing to find. If anyone's ever told you to trust your instincts, to speak up even when everyone else thinks you're overreacting, let me know in the comments, because Sam's persistence literally saved Leslie's life. He didn't give up. He kept questioning, kept pushing, kept believing that something was deeply wrong even when the easier path would have been to dismiss it all. Leslie Gatis was found alive on March 17, 1982. She was hospitalized, reunited with her family, and began the long process of recovery that would take years. Ernest Stubblefield was arrested that same night, convicted of kidnapping, and sentenced to 20 years in prison. But the story doesn't end there, because Leslie refused to let it end there. She became a lawyer, went to school, got her degree, built a career dedicated to helping others. She served on the board of the Commission on Missing and Exploited Children, using her experience, her survival, to help other families going through similar nightmares. She turned 119 days of hell into a lifetime of purpose. And Sam Drash, the headmaster who couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, who organized that stakeout even when it seemed paranoid, He went back to his quiet life running the elementary school. But he carried with him the knowledge that listening to that small voice of doubt, that instinct that something wasn't right, had made all the difference. If you've ever dismissed your instincts about something, if you've ever ignored a sign because everyone else told you it was nothing, trust yourself in the comments. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, someone who second-guesses themselves constantly, share this with them. Sometimes the thing that seems impossible is exactly what's happening. Sometimes the truth is stranger and more terrible than any fiction. Sometimes one person paying attention can change everything.